The Benedictine monk Bede wrote in the 700s that April was called the Easter month by the Anglo-Saxon pagans, and that feasts were held in honor of this Easter goddess. Jacob Grimm in 1835 reconstructed Ostra, or Easter, into a Proto-Germanic Ostara, relating her to other Indo-European dawn goddesses like Ostra in Latvian, Eos in Greek, and even far Ushas in Vedic. So all of them are hypothesized by Proto-Indo-European reconstructionists to have descended from this old Hewsos goddess of dawn. And the name Hewsos seems to mean shining, or dawn, or east, because shining, dawn, and east all became kind of the same word, and this is how words evolve a lot of the time. They take on multiple meanings, and they're used metaphorically, especially for deities and in poetry. So going back to Easter, what he's essentially saying is that Easter was inherited from this festival, this goddess, an Anglo-Saxon, and that from we found a Saxon goddess, Austron, in Germany. That may have been the original version, descending from this old Ostara complex. And in 1958, there was a discovery near Bonn, Germany, that's around here, of an inscription during the Roman era, Matrone Austriae, or the Mothers of the East, which proves or confirms that there was a or multiple dawn goddesses worshipped by the Germans. And the festivals of Easter correspond with the vernal equinox, and that's around March 21st. The end of March, so it's going into April. And that signaled the coming of spring, warmth, and growth. In Baltic mythology, and that's this region here, the Earth Mother Zemina is reborn as a young maiden on the vernal equinox. In Slavic mythology, this youth that's born on the equinox is called Kostroma or Kupala or Vesna, and I have Vesna here. And in Greek myth, of course, it kind of resembles the myth of Persephone ascending from the underworld in spring. Now, these particular motifs, as you can see, I colored them in green, include youth and spring, flowers, rabbits, and eggs, and that's a lot of what still survives in the Easter celebration today, are actually pointing to another goddess complex that I would like to save for a separate Persephone kind of related episode. And those are earth-coded myths, whereas the dawn goddess complex in this episode is going to be more sky-coded. Now, before we explore the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern dawn goddess, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of these proposed Indo-European linguistics and some of my methodology. The dotted blurbs here are reconstructed or hypothetical deities or epithets. And the arrows have three different kinds. There's the solid arrow, which corresponds with the solid connection. The dashed line corresponds with a hypothetical connection. And these tiny dotted lines mean that there's an influence. And the influence isn't necessarily an origin, it's often a later syncretism or some adopted traits that might have happened as those different mythologies were interacting. Here are some of the most important dawn goddess related Proto-Indo-European roots. The most important of them is, of course, I said Hewis, which means shining, dawn, east, and Istar, which means star. So just because Hewis and Istar are hypothetically Proto-Indo-European words doesn't mean that every deity around the world whose name sounds like and means even the same kind of thing must be Indo-European in origin. So that, I think, is one of the most common misconceptions and assumptions that I see made. Although we can trace certain hypothetical roots to, say, what we just covered with Ostara, Ishtar, and Astra, those are not just confirmed because they sound right or they sound similar and they correspond in meaning. They're confirmed because we have archaeological, mythological, historical evidence. There's a model that works, let's put it that way. There's an out of the step model of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, which I made a video about. And my mistake in that video, I suppose, was not pointing out that I'm not just talking about the Yamnaya. They're not the only Proto-Indo-European group. They're just one of many that were speaking whatever that language was at the time. But that hypothesis does not mean, for instance, that Ishtar, even though her name basically means shining star, the same exact meaning of Ostara, Ishtar, right? It doesn't, the Indo-European hypothesis does not adequately explain how Ishtar could be Indo-European in descent, right? There have been attempts to explain this. There are some alternative theories that the Akkadians were influenced by Indo-Europeans. Shortly after the Akkadians, the Hurrians got there, and the Hurrians have the most evidence for having a Indo-European adjacent or related pantheon. The Hurrians were non-Indo-European speaking language, but there's evidence that some of their upper class may have worshipped Indo-Aryan deities. There's also the Kassite hypothesis that they might have been Indo-European in origin. Perhaps they, in that very same upper class that the Hurrians had, because they were put in power over Babylon by the Hittites after the Hittites conquered Babylon, were around. So anyhow, there's no real good hypothesis for why that name sounds so similar, why basically the goddess, a lot of the aspects of the goddess have a lot in common. Like they could be considered to be basically the same goddess, especially in modern pagan neo-pagan reconstruction. My hypothesis is that it's a much older origin of those words that I've shown here, that star and aish are potentially the basis of Hewsos and Ishtar in Indo-European during the Caucasian Neolithic, around 6000 BC, potentially. That the word for star and the word for shining might have been at least that old. But my hypothesis also would include the possibility that it's even older than that it goes back to a hunter-gatherer common term. Who knows how old that is? And we see evidence around the world of certain names. The Inca dawn goddess's name is Ch'aska, and that sounds suspiciously like shining star. The Quechuan, that's Inca language. Aska in Quechuan does mean star, meaning of the ch at the beginning of Aska. It is an emphasis. It's a Ch'aska. It gives greater weight to the term. To me, sounds like very similar to this potential aish, sh, th, shining term. I mean, the only hypothesis possible in that case, other than that there was some sort of scam, so to speak, going on with the interpretation of the Inca records or names, would be that the general word for shining and for star are at least 20,000 or older years old. They go back to a broader Eurasian mother tongue, basically. To put a shining word onto a name for something is deifying it. It is the basis of deity in this sense. So that's a totally different video, maybe, breaking down that idea. It's part of why the Ashuras and Ahuras and Aesir and Acer in Indian, Iranian, Norse, and Etruscan mythology all sound similar and all mean basically the shining ones. The stars being the planets in particular, the moving planets, those were deified, I think, quite early on. Another interesting exception here when we're talking about the Indo-European dawn goddess, there's a deity, let's say this Mari goddess, Ujjarava. just because the Mari are part, in general, of a Finno-Ugric group of people. They're Permian, which is related to Finnic peoples over here, and Uralic people like Hungarians, ancestors over here. Just because they're considered a non-Indo-European culture and language family doesn't mean that Ujurava is necessarily not an Indo-European derived deity. There are a lot of Finno-Ugric deities that may have been, and in a lot of cases most certainly were, loaned to them or adopted by them from Indo-European people. So some of the most obvious versions of that would be horse deities or deities depicted on horse. Obviously, horse culture and the horse cults spread with the Indo-Europeans. Anyone who adopted a horse might have also adopted some of the ideas and mythology and motifs around the horse from the people they adopted it from. Of course, I said dawn goddess and dawn in general is a very old concept, and it's ambiguous, for instance, with the Finnish Amutar, whether that is yet another Indo-European loan or maybe a native dawn mother goddess in northern Eurasia that was there already before the Indo-Europeans. And also, it's important to note that Uralic people are basically 50% of Indo-European steppe ancestry. So steppe ancestry of the Indo-Europeans in this region was originally 50% coming down the river here, the Volga River, Finno-Ugric people, and 50% Caucasian Neolithic farmers and shepherds. That means that those groups were much older, and could they have had a dawn goddess that shared traits with Caucasian goddess of dawn, and they became this particular one? That's also a hypothesis that could be true. So this line could be going in either direction, to be honest, if I really take this and add another. Sometimes it's hypothetically could be in either direction, or maybe it's an exchange between them. So with the Hungarians, another Finno-Ugric people originally, they are some of the most mixed genetically, linguistically, culturally, mythologically with Indo-European peoples, because they adopted horse culture very early on. In fact, one of the first cultures with evidence of domesticating the horse was the bow tie culture in this region of basically ancestral Ugrian and Hungarian peoples. At the time, the region was likely a blend of Ugrian and Indo-European peoples. So the kind of blending of cultures happened all throughout this whole region, from like 6000 BC to 3000 BC. So how much of Hungarian culture and Hungarian deities might actually be loans from early Indo-European, or maybe even loaned to early Indo-European, concerning horses, concerning dawn, and so on. There is a prominent goddess of dawn. She's considered the dawn mother, and she has more birth associations than your regular dawn goddess does. In fact, another dawn goddess that has birth associations is all the way over here with the Yakut, who are a Turkic tribe in Siberia. She's a psychopomp in the morning at dawn, taking the souls of newborns into their bodies. So it's kind of the opposite of the death psychopomp going into the west, taking dead souls into the underworld. It's instead taking souls from the underworld through the sky into their new lives, their new bodies in the morning. So that's very interesting. It kind of parallels the concept of a stork in later Slavic and German folklore. And I suspect that maybe it is a larger North Eurasian idea, if someone could find some more examples of that in North Eurasia, and also in the Americas, because North Asians are related to Americans. There I have found many dawn goddesses in North America. I have mostly focused this time on the West Asian dawn goddess. So, concerning this Indo-European dawn goddess, what are her general traits? Well, she's almost always in a group of goddesses and sometimes gods that are associated with the sky and Venus and other planets. So in Baltic mythology, and Lithuanian in particular, is the daughter of the sun, obviously, along with a few other daughters of Mercury and Mars and Saturn and Jupiter. The Saturn and Jupiter ones might be later reconstructions, but mostly there's almost always a Mars, Mercury, and two Venus deities. One is the morning star and one is the evening star. Is the light of the morning or the light of the evening? And these are often treated as separate deities. At times, the dusk goddess gets syncretized or confused with the Mercury goddess as well. And that can also happen in the masculine sense, that sometimes the Mercury god is associated with the dusk god. Eos in Greek, oddly enough, is the mother not only of the planets, which is weird because she's not the sun goddess as the Solia Baltic mother of Austrine is a sun goddess, but instead Eos herself is the mother of all the planets and also of the anemoi, or the winds, the four directions. Notice Boreas, Zephyr, and Eurus. The planets in Greek are Stilbon, Hesperus, Phosphorus, Pyros, Phaethon, and Phaenon, and those are, of course, the 5 visible planets, and then an extra one for Venus, dusk versus morning. And a lot of confusing things about Greek is sometimes there's a duplication of layers, so to speak. There are multiple generations of Titans that basically do some of the same thing, representing some of the same ideas, and then the regular Olympian gods maybe have the same thing. So, like, for instance, we have Aphrodite as an Olympian era goddess of dawn, yet Eos is an older Titan goddess of dawn. And we're told that Eos is the mother of Hesperus and Phosphorus, who are the dusk and dawn gods, for example, and yet she is married to Astraeus, who, for all intents and purposes, is a god of the dusk and of the west, just like her own son, Hesperus. Something that blew my mind, actually, when I was working on this, I was looking for a West Asian goddess of shining, basically. So I talked about the linguistics of maybe that is the basis of Hewsos in a pre-Indo-European Neolithic pantheon. You could see it potentially rising up in Astarte in Semitic, becoming Ishtar. It could crop up in Al-Uzza, the Arabian dawn goddess, or even in the Egyptian Al-Set, which is the basis of Isis. And Isis is like Ishtar in many ways, but slightly different. More Egyptian flavor, more separate evolution. And I couldn't find too much evidence necessarily that's very strong that Ishtar, Ashtart, maybe of the Phoenicians, entered Egypt, perhaps during the Hyksos dynasty or something, which was a dynasty of Canaanites that ruled them. Or possibly there's an older Afro-Asiatic common goddess of light and shining that became Alset and Isis in Egypt, and also Astarte in Mesopotamia. And although Afro-Asiatic languages are really only in this whole section, southern section here, we know that the Neolithic people probably existed a little bit before 10,000 BC, which is the oldest estimated date of Afro-Asiatic languages existing. They came out of some other language, probably a Neolithic language, and that Neolithic language probably spread and split into multiple different Neolithic groups. Very quickly, that would be Anatolian Neolithic, Caucasian Neolithic, Iranian Neolithic, and then Levantine Neolithic. And Levantine would be right here, basis of Afroasiatic languages. So, in my hypothesis, all of those different groups, complexes, originated from a complex of Neolithic culture, language, technology, etc. So, with that hypothesis in play, I was looking for a goddess that would be attested in Asia Minor, somewhere in Anatolia, in this region that bridges between them all, where some of the oldest cities, Catalhoyuk, Göbekli Tepe, and such were created. And we know that Anatolian Neolithic farmers are the early European farmers. So if there was any record of this goddess, it would be pointing in this direction. And we have it. It's one of the most under-talked about goddesses that has extreme importance in the lineage that the Greeks have for the Titans. Yet there's not much about her. There's not much else going on. And clearly some of her aspects have gotten gobbled up by other Titans or other deities throughout time. And that's Asia. And Asia literally means goddess of Asia Minor. This is named for not just all of this continent here, but specifically for Anatolia to the Greeks. So when they were pointing towards Asia in the east, that's what they were talking about. But the name Asia itself means goddess of the east, or goddess of shining, shining goddess, right? And I was like, wait, no, of course it does. That makes perfect sense. That would be literally the basis of what my hypothesis is here. So her other name is Clymene, which is herd lady, which really means like she's heard everywhere, or she's famous. And that's similar in idea to the idea of Eurynome, many name goddess, who is purported to be the first goddess, basically one of the first deities in ancient Greek myth, at least in alternative Orphic treatments. And Orphic tradition is kind of potentially from Anatolia. Eurynome and Ophion were the first deities, and Ophion was a giant serpent. And Asia is in the Greek family tree is a Titan married to the Titan Iapetus. And Iapetus is a god of creation, and he's associated with the Pillar of the West, just like Astraeus and Atlas are. So once again, we have that Western deity coupled with Eastern goddess. The resemblance between Asia and Eos is pretty great. Eos's partner is Astraeus, and so we might purport that Asia could be a remnant of the original Eos before Indo-Europeans came and brought that particular linguistics or that particular set of more sky-related traits. And in a lot of reconstructions of what a Pelasgian pantheon would be, they talk about this Eurynome as being a potentially very old. Next, let's finally get to Aphrodite. Apru is the Etruscan name for Aphrodite. And the Etruscans basically gave the Romans the entire Greek pantheon. So everything that the Romans have in Greek is translated through Etruscan. And much of what the Romans have as a mythology in general is inherited from the Etruscan. Like most of the names, like Minerva and Jove, are derived from Etruscan deities, and those were syncretized in Etruscan with Greek deities. Etruscan is non-Indo-European, yet it's heavily influenced in its religion by Greek ideas. And what it is that was originally Etruscan and non-Greek is pretty difficult to discern at times. For the sake of this goddess, the Etruscans' version of Aphrodite, Venus, was Turan, and she is almost identical to Aphrodite, even sharing some of the mirrors have imagery of some of the later myths or stories like the Iliad being referenced in Etruscan sources. Thesan is actually a dawn goddess that's a little higher, more astral than Turan. and she resembles Eos in a great many ways. She's even in a chariot in the sky. And all of those are motifs that would imply an Indo-European descent anyway. So even if there was pre-Indo-European Etruscans there, they adopted Indo-European motifs quite quickly. But they did retain their own separate language, and they did retain their own culture in many ways too. So to connect to the celebration of Easter, there's another celebration called Perilia that the Romans had in late April, because we kind of moved our months around. April is named after Aphrodite. So that's a definite correlation there with Easter as a goddess, since both are goddesses of dawn. There's also particular attention in the Perilia festival on Aphrodite's or Apru or Venus's lover at that point, which is Pales. And Pales is a lot like Adonis. He's a shepherd. To me, it resembles the very old Phoenician or even older Neolithic possible story motif. We have a similar thing with Ishtar and Dumuzid in the Middle East. The dawn goddess being partners with a shepherd. With Roman, we have Aurora as their version of Eos, and she is identical in almost every way as well. So Venus right here means or might mean love or desire. We talked about Vesna, which very much sounds like Venus being a similar spring deity. And the linguistics there may be this ekna, bright, or star word gone into Vesna, and also Yastra in Palabian Slavic might be cognate with it. But of course, the Slavs got to Slovenia much later, during the medieval era, so they definitely weren't there to influence the Romans. Whatever might have been Indo-European about Vesna as a term would have had to be in the Italic people, perhaps, that came down and split off from Celts. It could also be that the celebrations and the ideas of Venus influenced the Slovenians when they arrived to Slovenia, and maybe they took their deity, Kostroma, Capuala, conflated a few traits and a few names with Venus. That's also a possibility in my mind. That's what this line is. So anyhow, where does Aphrodite come from? The main hypothesis that scholars believe, and I am partial to this one, is that she descends, at least most of her traits descend from Ishtar, Inanna, in the Middle East. And through a big line of connections that I will explain in a minute, they eventually got to the Phoenicians in Cyprus, and then the Greeks adopted this Astarte and began calling her Aphrodite. Hesiod said that Aphrodite's name means foam-born, but there are a lot of scholars that say this might be a folk etymology, made up after a fact, that the original name is not necessarily known, or that was derived from Astarte in some way. There is an alternative hypothesis that Aphrodite might be derived from Aphrodita in Illyrian. And Albanian is an Illyrian descended language. Whether they adopted Aphrodite from the Greeks, like the Illyrians adopted many things from the Greeks, or perhaps when the Dorians, who were Northwest Greek speakers, lived in this region right next to the Illyrians, perhaps they inherited goddess Aphrodite of coming day, right? A dawn goddess. The Dorian invasion is questioned as a real thing, but we know that the language dialect of Greek, Doric, definitely seemed to expand at a particular time in history around the purported time of the Dorian invasion, which would be 1100 BCE. We know that during the Trojan Wars or before the Trojan Wars, whatever those were, that the Achaeans were dominant throughout the Peloponnese and also Crete and Rhodes. These were Mycenaeans, but by the time of modern times and by the time of the classical Greek period, most of these places were speaking Doric Greek. We have no attestations of the Mycenaeans worshipping a goddess by the name of Aphrodite. We just don't have it. That name does not seem to exist until after the Greek Dark Ages, so the time of Hesiod. and Homer and the classical Greeks afterwards. That would definitely imply that the Dorian invasion or some movement from this direction was the basis of her particular name. I would wonder then what dawn goddess, if any, the Mycenaeans were worshipping. We do have record of Asia being a goddess that was of note to the Mycenaeans. They worshipped her as Potnia Asawia. And Asawia is the name for Asia in Mycenaean. So again, that would imply that maybe the Minoans, maybe the Pelasgians, had a goddess like Asia that the incoming Mycenaeans, Indo-Europeans, looked at and said, oh, this is the goddess of Asia. This is the goddess of what we're calling this whole region, Anatolia, right? And those were written in Linear B, so that's a Minoan-derived script before any Phoenician script got to Greece. The Phoenician influence throughout Greece did not really happen until after the Greek Dark Ages or during the Greek Dark Ages. Both of those hypotheses working together could be a really interesting explanation for how this goddess came out of nowhere and became so important. So another little aspect of this is the Greeks always referred to Aphrodite as being from one of two places. One is this island here next to Aphrodite called Kythera, but the main place that she's associated with and said to have been born at the seaside of was Cyprus. Her epithet is Kypris. And I talked about this in my Great Goddess video a little bit, but I learned a lot more since then. I've learned that there are a few scholars looking into Cyprus that believe the goddess that the Greeks called Kypris was a blend of the Phoenician Astarte and an older Anatolian, Pelasgian, Etio-Cypriotic, so true Cypriotic, like old Cypriotic, more related to Etio-Cretan or Minoan goddess. That was more of an agricultural deity, more related to mountains and the earth. And that would be very distinct from the oceanic and sky associations of Aphrodite. I'm convinced by that. It makes more sense to me that Kypris is actually related to the Anatolian and Pelasgian Earth Mother or Earth Goddess or Earth Queen Cybele than to Astarte and Aphrodite. There's another name for another goddess that is Kabiro on the island of Lemnos. And the Lemnians were related to the Tyrrhenians or the Etruscans. And in general, my hypothesis is that they were Pelasgian people, that Pelasgian people who were pre-Indo-European people living in the Aegean and most of the Mediterranean before the Indo-Europeans and Phoenicians got there. Kabiro was the mother goddess of Lemnos. Her partner was Hephaestus. So the entire cult of Hephaestus originates in Lemnos, and this implies that Hephaestus is a Pelasgian Neolithic type smithing god. And in Greek stories, of course, who is Hephaestus' wife? It's Aphrodite. And there's always a trying kind of relationship between them. And of course, when you look at the Phoenician motifs that we're talking about with the shepherd, it makes much more sense that Aphrodite is partnered with Adonis or Ares or some other type of shepherd god. So why is she then partnered with Hephaestus in the kind of later Greek retellings of the story? Well, my suggestion here, the Greeks saw Kabiro on Lemnos, the original wife of Hephaestus, and they assumed that this Kabiro was Kypris, because the linguistics seem the same. Kypris either means the island of Cyprus or it means copper. Copper was mined on the island of Cyprus. It was the largest copper mines in the Mediterranean and some of the earliest ones to be used. So this copper Cyprian goddess was considered to be the same. And it makes sense also why a copper goddess would be partnered with a smithing god, by the way. The Greeks kind of implied that Kabiro represented the water that you throw the hot metal into in order to cool. and such. And that's kind of the way that they made it work. But my suggestion here is that this original earth goddess, fertility, agricultural deity of Cyprus, more related to Cybele in the mainland of Anatolia, and also Rhea in Minoan origins, was the actual identity of Kibiro here in Lemnos. And that the reason Hephaestus and Cybele were partners is because Hephaestus and to an extent Vulcan are descended from the Minoan and the Pelasgian Velkanos or Voltumna. Voltumna is the Etruscan name, Velkanos is the Minoan name for this agricultural deity that also happened to do smithing and also winemaking and a few different things. There are multiple arts that he practiced and he learned. And Velkanos came to be syncretized with Zeus by the Indo-Europeans. But originally he was a chthonic deity, not at all a sky god, not at all a thunder god. Because he was originally the king of the gods. He was originally a chthonic and an earth goddess that were together ruling the Pelasgian pantheon. Again, kind of an aside, an exception, but if you ever find these epithets or names, just remember that it's not always what the Greeks say it is. And so, over here, looking at the Levant now, something strange happened here where Atherat or Ashura is another name for her, as she was worshipped in Canaan. Seems to be the goddess of the heavenly lady, and this heavenly lady is often conflated with Ishtar. But whether they are indeed the same or not, I will leave up to you. I am always going back and forth on the matter. Nonetheless, the Arameans in this region of Aram adopted Athtar from the Ugarites, and they also syncretized her with Atharat. They called her Ataratha, and eventually that became shortened to Taratha. And that during the time of the Greeks in the Levant, so after Alexander's conquests, became Atargatis or Derketo, and she was treated basically as a Levantine Phoenician Aphrodite. So it's almost like going back to the roots of the Greeks. When they finally conquered this region, they noticed this goddess, and essentially they were seeing Aphrodite without all the Greek Aphrodite changes going on. So Taratha Atargatis is associated with doves and fish, and she's sometimes depicted as a mermaid in the sea. And yes, there's a lot more like watery kind of motifs going on. At time in my other Cybele video, I talked about how this deity is often conflated with Cybele in this region, and even the Greeks and the Romans did so quite often. They would conflate Derketo with Dea Sura, the goddess of Syria, is properly supposed to be the agricultural goddess Sirash, but they would sometimes conflate her with this Atargatis Taratha, Aphrodite, fish and doves, more oceanic character. So like I distinguish between the oceanic, dawn goddess versus the agricultural mother. I think those are very distinct. The Greeks and Romans did not always draw those distinctions. And that's part of another reason that I think this misunderstanding of the Cyprian agricultural goddess was also kind of conflated with the sea goddess motif. So yes, the Phoenicians adopted Ishtar from Ugaritic, and that became the Astarte in Cyprus. And then the Phoenicians and Canaanites interacting with Hebrews. Eventually the Hebrews demonized this goddess and called her Ashtaroth. And whenever they add Roth at the end, they're basically a shame, is what that means. And they would have many different deities and just shame at the end. And yes, the very last note I had here is Andromeda, because Andromeda is in the story or the myth, the legend of Perseus, supposed to be sacrificed to Keto, the sea monster, and Perseus saves her. And this is overall a very similar motif, actually, to the Hurrian myth of Shaushka, who, when there's a giant sea monster coming to destroy a city, she lays out on the beach and seduces the monster. So it saves the people. This sounded like kind of a similar motif to, although Andromeda is treated as a damsel, Shaushka is the hero in that particular story. And it's kind of an interesting reversal. I wonder how much of the Greek perspective was changing it there. Perseus in that story, of course, kind of resembles something of a Zeus, riding Pegasus. And Zeus sometimes is said to, well, ultimately Zeus is said to ride Pegasus. Pegasus becomes his horse eventually. And the storm god in general, in many cases, is riding the clouds. And once horses became a thing, they started to ride horses. And Zeus in ancient myths, as well as Marduk and Baal and all these storm gods, they defeat a serpent, they liberate cities, these types of things. So I've always looked at the Perseus and Andromeda myth as a remnant of many other older myths, potentially just made more humorized, more human scale. And all of that leads us back to the Astarte origins. So I already kind of ventured my hypothesis that this Aish, Ace wording and this Sta wording were a Neolithic West Asian thing, right? That they could have been used at any time, and that this goddess of shining star would have been very old. And that this shining star in particular was associated with Venus. It was literally the planet Venus. Everyone can look at that. They had to have a name for it. That was the name that they chose. The oldest attested name of Ishtar we can find is actually in Ebla. So Ebla and Eblaite, it's a very specific city in Syria, is basically one of the oldest Semitic cities that we can locate with inscriptions, that is. So it's some of the oldest inscriptions, the oldest writing, the oldest imagery that we can kind of use, apart from, really old kind of Göbekli Tepe statues and whatnot that don't necessarily have things that we could decipher other than symbology. And it was Ashtarte, literally a shining star lady. In the West, this seemed to spread to the Ugaritic Othtar. The Ash became an Oth. This is a common thing that can happen with different Semitic languages, and that would have been around 3000 BC. And in the other direction, 2900 BC, to Mari, which is a city on the Euphrates River. So essentially, the Semitic people were moving down the river, spreading this goddess along with them. These migrations correspond with archaeological evidence that we have of a few different cultures, like the Mari culture and whatnot, that were slowly kind of moving from this region down into the Sumerian region. So the Sumerians were non-Indo-European and non-Semitic. They were a separate group of people that lived here, as well as the Elamites. They were slightly different from the Sumerians and part of more of an Iranian Neolithic group. Sumerians, we don't know exactly what Neolithic group they are. It's quite mysterious. Some people suspect they might just be related to Elamites. Maybe they were an upper class that spoke their own language. Or the craziest hypothesis, which is actually kind of fun, is that they're related to an old ancestral Eurasian people living in Arabia. That's why some of their holy sites are down here. But anyhow, separate from Ishtar, we have Inanna originating. Since the Sumerians are so old as a civilization and so sophisticated as a civilization, it's assumed that Inanna and all of her different epithets and all these dawn goddess, war goddess, just goddess, and aspects of her were native to Sumer, and I tend to believe that as well. It seems to me that the Semitic people were largely shepherds at this time, and a few places started to have cities and farming, of course. There was always farming. But that most of the migrating Semitic peoples down into Sumer, which would include the Akkadians here with the first appearance of Ishtar around the same time, were working as seasonal laborers in the farms of the Sumerians, and sometimes eventually as mercenaries. As things started to desertify a little bit more and more during this period, the 3000s and whatnot. Shepherds would have had to kind of take what they could get from time to time. A lot of them became warriors and mercenaries alongside shepherding. And like I said, they would be farmers for hire, immigrant farmers for hire, basically, for the Sumerians. Eventually, they overthrew the Sumerians. They were enslaved and they were overthrown by Sargon of Akkad. As a cupbearer, he led a revolution against the Sumerians, and the Sumerians never quite recovered again after that. Point is, these are two different cultures, and Inanna, many of her aspects seem to have merged in with this Ishtar goddess. Now, how many things went the other way, or we don't all exactly know. The mainstream hypothesis is actually that the Semitic people did not have Astarte as a female deity originally. So their hypothesis would actually be that these arrows are going in this direction in these exact periods, and that the dawn god of the Semites, Ishtaran, or Othar, and all these different names, which I have in a different chart thing here, was, a male dawn god, and that Inanna, being a female dawn goddess, was adopted as kind of a counterpart to Ishtaran, as Ishtar down here in Akkadian, and then migrated back up to Ebla. If the scholars are correct, and maybe they are, Inanna would be a very old goddess with its own origins that we simply do not know. And there are a lot of other epithets here. Ninciana means Lady Red Heaven, so there's a lot of times that the dawn goddess is associated with the color red. Sometimes it's the dusk goddess that is too, but this is alluding to the color of the sky when it is dawn or dusk. There's Zora in the Slavic word name, for instance, might actually be a word for red. There's also Sherida, which the name means shining or morning, and perhaps is another epithet of hers. But scholars also are not certain whether that is a native Sumerian word. It might be a loan from Akkadian, and the goddess herself, Aya, which is an Akkadian goddess, is the partner of the sun god Shamash. And the Sumerians have Utu as a sun god, so Utu's partner is Sherida. But yeah, it's not exactly known whether this was a relationship that came from Akkadian influence or was a relationship that the Sumerians gave to the Akkadians, or the Akkadians adopted from the Sumerians. So that arrow is kind of going in both directions. Then we have some weird cases with the Elamites. And again, the Elamites are living so close to the Sumerians, and yet their language is not identical. Many of their gods are traded back and forth, however, as they would be conquering each other and back and forth a lot of the time. And then the Elamites, we know, are genetically and in some linguistic hypotheses related to Dravidians, who maybe were the Indus Valley River Valley Civ people, and also the Oxus civilization up here. So this entire Iranian Neolithic region, they seem to have been a very important piece of it. Which, if we look at the records, some of the oldest cities, like Ganj Dareh around here in Iran, were some of the oldest cities in the world, by far. Basically, the mountain regions were some of the oldest cities and settlements in the world. Susiana just means the Susa lady, so that's the city of Susa, their patron deity. So that would imply that their patron deity was basically Inanna. And whether that means the Sumerians adopted Inanna or the other way around, we can't necessarily always know. So yes, that completes most of the Sumerian cluster. Some crazy pie in the sky hypotheses and arrows I have going around here are a few different deities that resemble a dawn goddess similar to Inanna, but are in places that it would be hard to explain how they got there. And then we have crazy enough, all the way over here in Norse, we have Nanna, who is the wife of Balder, and Balder, of course, dies and she mourns him. And this is a very similar motif to Inanna mourning Dumuzid when he dies. Now, of course, a lot of the Norse sagas were written much later in history, during times that people could have read about these ancient Sumerian Babylonian myths and then taken aspects of them down, like Snorri compiling the Eddas in Iceland could have done. I also forgot to mention that another Proto-Indo-European root for before or early that might be associated with dawn in many cases is found in the Albanian and Illyrian Prende or Perenda, and some people hypothesize this is part of Persephone's name, first light maybe, a meaning of the name, same as Prende, the dawn goddess of Albanians, and that it resembles also Freya in Norse, goddess of dawn in Norse pantheon. And then some people hypothesize, and I don't disagree, that Varahi and Varaha might be cognate with Frey and Freya in Vedic sources, and so I included that as well. There were, in fact, agrarian people descended from Mediterranean and Anatolian farmers who made their way up into southern Scandinavia. That is a fact. So whatever pantheon they believed before the Indo-Europeans got there and became mixed with them to become Norse, there'd be a lot more agrarian stuff going on. There'd be a lot more remnants still. We have Nani in Armenian. Armenian is considered Indo-European, but the reality is so much of its ancestry is from Urartu or Urartian people who lived here, and the Urartians themselves are descended or related to the Hurrians. So the Hurrians have been interacting with the Middle East for a very, very long time. I talked about them. They adopted very many Akkadian and Babylonian deities like Ishtar into their pantheon, and they wrote many stories with slight variations on them. So Shaushka is the Hurrian Ishtar. So how many of these Hurrian deities directly became Armenian through a Hurrian source, which would be non-Indo-European, and how many came from an Indo-European source separately, right, during the genesis of the Armenian people much later. And at the same time, they share a lot of genetic and mythological roots with other Caucasian people who would have been descended more directly from Caucasian Neolithic people in 6000 BC. So Armenian, whenever you think of Armenian, don't think of them as pure Indo-European. Think of them as a really rich blend of a lot of different influences here. And Armenians, of course, are very influenced by Iranians as well in Zoroastrianism in their pantheon. Then, of course, Zoroastrianism and the Iranians much later were influenced, of course, by the Middle East and the Babylonians when they conquered them and interacted with them, getting a few deities like Arshtat, who is straight up Ishtar, and she's treated as like a just good dawn goddess, whereas Jahi, another derivative of Ishtar's more sexual and war aspects, is treated as demonic. So this is an interesting dualism that the Zoroastrians had, where they adopt the positive attributes of Ishtar and also the negative attributes, but they split them into two. This is kind of a similar polarization that happens with Judaism over here, and also Mandaean sort of mysticism, with Lilith and Zariel being these demonized forms of Ishtar, basically, at least in part. Lilith is derived from the lily, which is a Sumerian night demon in the form of an owl that lives on the world tree, the Hulapu tree. So that Lilith is mythologically said to be the first wife of Adam is interesting because the lily spirits are kind of like harpies living on the world tree. Strange outside connections would be certain deities that get syncretized with dawn deities, such as these Guan Yin and whatnot. There's a sort of queen of morning clouds in China. And there's also this crazy exception here I wanted to bring up with in Japanese mythology with Uzume, and to a lesser extent Waka Hairume, who is kind of like the either daughter or sister of the sun god Amaterasu. Of course, the sun goddess Amaterasu is the most important in Japanese, and I wanted to point out how that's kind of similar to some of the Baltic stuff I've seen with Solis Mita, Austrian with Solia, the sun goddess. But here with Uzume, there are a lot of people that point to this as too similar to Ushas and to Hewsos as a dawn goddess, and meaning the same thing, and being that same type of goddess. Whether there was a very old dawn goddess that we've seen already, you see it up here with the Yakut, obviously that must be very old. Maybe there's just a dawn goddess with hunter-gatherers out of Africa, Eurasian mythology, where there's some sort of story beats or some sort of dawn goddess, some sort of Venus goddess that is already acknowledged and treated in a similar sense. Maybe that's how old the root is. Maybe the root is as old as the horse cult. This is another hypothesis, is that basically horsemanship and the horse cult would have reached Japan around 300s in the Common Era, so that's 300 AD-ish, from the mainland, from China and Korea. That's a date where perhaps some of these Indo-European derived deities could have come from. So like horse-like deities and whatnot. Uzume being a dawn goddess. If she was indeed Tocharian, which would be this region of Indo-European people that lived here and mixed with a bunch of the Xiongnu and whatnot, whether maybe some aspects of the steppe culture up here influenced China and Korea and then Japan to get that idea there. That is a possibility. I wouldn't count it out entirely. It could be that, the idea of poetry and story and certain stories and certain characters came out of that. The roughly earliest time that we could suggest that would be was 380, so off like pretty late historically speaking. Nonetheless, when the Buddhists got there around 500 CE, they could have influenced with Vedic and Hindu Buddhist ideas. But even before them, 200 or so years earlier, there could have been a spread of those motifs that would have looked like Shinto, indigenous Japanese practice, to the incoming Buddhists. So yeah, that's two hypotheses, or really three. The third one is just that, it's a common motif Eurasians have. And then I wanted to point out a few other exceptions on here. I already showed the Americas a little bit, but there's also a Austronesian dawn goddess, and the Philippines has a few different names, quite a few different names for different dawn goddesses that might be the same. And they spread this kind of silver white goddess, sometimes associated with the moon, sometimes dawn. There's another dawn goddess down here that's kind of a fertility goddess, more similar to Persephone, which is an interesting thing to look at some other time. And we see Ina, Hina, kind of going all the way around. So yes, at that, I think I have shown most of the chart.